You're watching Toronto Sports Rush on the Bet Rivers Network.
Hey everyone, welcome on into McGuire Mondays, Toronto Sports Rush. I'm Julie Stewart-Binks, joined by Pierre McGuire, of course. And I have to get right to the big news of the day, Pierre, and that is that I have completely dismantled all of the intercostal muscles on one side of my body. So you thankfully let us move the podcast a little bit because I couldn't even do my setup or anything like that. But I'm playing hurt right now, but I'm playing. And it reminded me, Pierre, that during this time before game one of the Stanley Cup Final, there is quite a bit of time off for some of these guys. And I hurt myself doing just deadlifts, like regular weight strength training. And we've seen random injuries in the past happen to guys. How much are they thinking about something like keeping themselves safe and not just like tripping and falling over and not being able to play in the Stanley Cup?
I think guys always pay attention to that stuff, Julian. I'm glad to see it looking so. You look fantastic. Nobody would ever know you were hurt, so never let them see you sweat.
Right.
But good for you for playing hurt. It's playoff time, and most of the guys are a little bit nicked up. But no, usually guys are just focusing on trying to get to the trainer's room, get rehab. The cool thing for both these teams, the extra time off will help a lot of their star players. I feel badly for Edmonton, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but I got to say it. They're going to miss Zach Hyman. I know Corey Perry's been really good for them, but they're going to miss Zach Hyman, and they're not getting Zach Hyman back. They did get Matthias Ekholm back. That's a positive for him, even though Troy Stetcher was playing great for Edmonton. But I would say this, that injury is going to have some weight as the series goes along. And if you look at it, there's two different times in the series where there's 3-day breaks, which is good for both teams. But if Edmonton doesn't get off to a good start on home ice, I don't know how much that's going to help them with Hyman being out.
Okay, and I want to go into Hyman in 1 second, but I'll just ask you sort of a follow-up on this time. It's good physically for these guys to have some of this time off, especially just the banged up bodies, the hockey that they've played over the last 3 years, especially for Florida. But mentally, how do they deal with kind of like having a week off when you know the biggest series of your life is just like on the precipice?
It's pretty easy to do, especially if you've got coaches that have experience. So Knobloch's got some experience from last year. Maurice has got a wealth of experience from all his time doing it. Usually you measure your practices, so you start a little bit slow and then you gear up your practice, you get closer. Having live scrimmages with real referees is something we used to do when I was in Pittsburgh. It made the guys feel like they were more in a game environment. So there are a lot of different thoughts and processes that people go through. But I think you start by tapering your practices back at the beginning, and then as you get closer, you pick them up a little bit. But again, I think everybody now sees light at the end of the tunnel. It's such a long, demanding season of 82 games. We had the Four Nation event this year. Players on both sides played in the Four Nations. So there's a fatigue factor on both sides. I think you're onto something there, though, Julie.
I think like it's interesting mentally and physically, right? Because you have so much ahead of you, and like the biggest opportunity of your NHL career, what everyone dreams of doing is winning the Stanley Cup. And I commend them mentally for having the ability to sort of temper the emotions and sort of the, as you said, sort of dial it up, I know physically in practice, but also dialing it up emotionally, because I can imagine just even trying to go to sleep or they're with their families. You know, they did the walk for the Gaudreau brothers yesterday, the Florida Panthers did, or on Saturday. And so the idea that like you're kind of like getting ready for the Stanley Cup, but you're also trying to still have some semblance of like, okay, I can't be so dialed in already or I'll be so mentally fatigued at puck drop. And just to switch gears back to what you had said, when we talk about people being healthy, everyone has talked a lot about, of course, Zach Hyman being out. So for those who don't know as much about what Zach Hyman has brought to this Oilers team, how would you classify what now changes about the identity of the Oilers without him?
Well, first of all, you look at Zach, he's a tremendous forechecker, a lot like what Dustin Brown used to be for the LA Kings. Zach's also the defensive conscience of the line when he plays with McDavid and with Zach Hyman, or sorry, not with Zach Hyman, with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. So he's a defensive conscience as well. He's probably the most robust player they have when it comes to being able to get slot area presence against the opponents in the offensive zone. And I think the biggest thing, he's a really underrated playmaker. Yeah, he gets some presence for scoring goals, but I think he's a way underrated playmaker. So you put it all together. Corey Perry's a nice guy, and he's a real good fit, and I marvel at the fact that he's still able to play at such a high level. He's got a wealth of experience, but he's not the same as Zach Hyman. Mm-hmm. And so for Corey, he's going to have to do the things that make him really good. Be that slot area presence. Be the guy that can get the players uncomfortable on the other side. Be that guy that is really responsible with the puck on his stick in his own zone. But I don't know if he doesn't have the get up and go speed-wise that Zach Hyman has. So that's going to be a little bit of a difference for that line. Yep.
It's certainly. And when you mentioned Corey Perry, everyone talks about, he's 40 years old playing in the Stanley Cup final. He's the only guy on the Oilers that has won a Stanley Cup. And that, of course, came quite a long time ago with the Anaheim Ducks in his first season in the league. And he's been in 6 Stanley Cup finals, 4 of them were recent that he was on the losing side of it. And I think that I actually talked to him after the Tampa Bay one and that he had lost, because I just said, how are you doing with this? Like, how do you deal with watching another team consistently hoist the cup in front of you? Like, that has to, I would imagine there'd be a lot of therapy for something like that, because you'd want to be able to still keep going, but it's got to have some kind of effect on you mentally. So what do you think how do you think Corey Perry would be dealing with this? And how do you think maybe what he's gone through could be an asset for the Oilers?
Well, first of all, I think it is an asset. You talked about the 07 Cup when he was in Anaheim. They beat Ottawa in 5 games. He and Ryan Getzlaf were the new guys on the block, so to speak. Think about the veteran presence with Scotty Niedermayer and Christopher Pronger and Teemu Selanne. They had an amazingly good veteran team that taught a lot of life lessons to Getzlaf and to Perry. But I don't think anything really bothers Corey. I remember watching him for the first time at the tryout camp for the 05 World Junior team. Eventually, he made the team. He was life and death to make it, and he played on the line with Sidney Crosby and Patrice Bergeron. Julie was an unbelievable line. That's the best World Junior of all time, because we didn't have NHL hockey that year. So all these young players that should have been in the NHL, they were actually playing in the World Junior. Hey, the Russians had Ovechkin and Malkin on the same team. Think about that in a World Junior, which is amazing. But I think for Corey, he's just battle-tested. And then he wins the Memorial Cup in 05 as well, playing for Dale Hunter and the Hunter brothers down in London. I think Corey's one of those tough guys that nothing really bothers him. And so I think he will have learned. If I were looking at it as a person that's been around the league, I'd say it reminds me of Marian Hossa. Comes from Atlanta to Pittsburgh, loses in 08, goes from Pittsburgh to Detroit, loses in 09, goes from Detroit to Chicago, and wins in 10. At some point, the odds are going to go on your side, and you're going to eventually win. So if I were Corey Perry, that's how I'd be looking at it, a lot like what Marian Hossa did when he went from Pittsburgh to Detroit to Chicago.
Right. Yeah. And you make a great point. Like, he's back in the Stanley Cup final too. And he is very resilient, as we've seen on the ice, in the fact that his career is extended this long, and then he's back in a Stanley Cup final. And when you just mentioned the World Juniors, you reminded me of when he didn't make Team Canada in 2016 for the World Cup. And I was covering him for the Anaheim Ducks, and I'd asked him about how he had a hat trick that day when he was left off the Team Canada roster. And I'd asked him after the game, which, like, I got in trouble for asking this because they thought it would, like, affect him, because I said, how much was being left off Team Canada influence you in the game today? And he said 100%. Like, you want to prove people wrong. And that's, I think, such a great, when he said that, it felt like that's who Corey Perry is. Like, if people are writing him off, or people are, he's a battler, right? Like, he's not afraid of, obviously, being a pest, being the worm, all that kind of stuff. So I think that'll be interesting to see how he does. But let's get to overall. We know that both of these teams played each other last year in the Stanley Cup. They're both a bit different, and one of them also has a Stanley Cup, which is Florida Panthers. When you look at this series as a whole, Pierre, what does your gut tell you about who you think has the advantage and where it is?
Well, I think Florida has an advantage because of their depth down the middle, Julie. If you look at it, you start with Sasha Barkov, then you go to Sammy Bennett, then you go to Anton Lundell, then you go to Thomas Nosek. So 1, 2, 3, 4, I think they're deeper and they're better. Now, that's hard to say because Draisaitl and McDavid are the first two centers for the Edmonton Oilers. But I think if you go 4 centers deep, and this is not a knock on Adam Henrique, by the way, who's a third center in Edmonton, but I think Anton Lundell is that X-factor player that Florida has that Edmonton does not have at the center ice position. And I think Tomas Nosek is that same thing for Florida as well. So that's one part where I think they have it different. The other part is at the trade deadline. Brad Marchand coming over and also Seth Jones coming over. Those two players bring a wealth of experience, not so well for Marchand, a ton of playoff experience. For Seth Jones, excitement and understanding his role and thriving in his role right now. And I think those two players make Florida a little bit better than what they were a year ago.
Yes, those have been incredible acquisitions for them as we've seen so far. And when you do look at Florida, it feels as though there really isn't any hole, I'd say. But how would you feel the goaltending matchup is? Both of these guys, Stuart Skinner and Sergei Bobrovsky, have experience in the Stanley Cup Finals we saw last year, but both of them are in different ways have had experience in the league, and they've had different playoffs so far. Who do you think holds the advantage there?
I would say the Florida Panthers. 1, because Bobrovsky has won. 2, he's played in the Olympics. 3, he's had a wealth of success. And I admire Stuart Skinner so much. Athletically, he must be an amazing athlete, but mentally, he must be so tough. Think about it. In the first round, after 2 games against LA, they're down 2-0, and they pull him. They go to Calvin Pickard. Pickard plays, wins a series, starts a series against Vegas. Pickard wins, then he gets hurt, so Skinner has to come back in. Skinner's first full start in the second round against Vegas, he loses with less than a half a second to go. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, oh, no, here we go again. And then Stuart Skinner throws 2 shutouts at Vegas back-to-back, and they win. It's just an amazing thing. So I have so much respect for that man. But to say that at this point in his career that he's a better goalie than Sergei Bobrovsky, I think would be a reach. I really do. I think it'd be a reach.
Make some great points there. And we've made it this far in our conversation, have not yet mentioned Connor McDavid, who is obviously such an incredible star and has the ability to change a game, as we've seen multiple times throughout the playoffs so far. And it feels as though, having watched him since last year, everything that he was yelling at his teammates that everyone has seen, the dig-in clips, to then being the game-winning or scoring the game-winning goal for Canada at the Four Nations, to now, and him being very calm, as we've seen in the press conference, sort of like heading into this, saying that when they won against Dallas, you know, it was a different way that they had decided to sort of celebrate it. When you look at Connor McDavid now and just the, I guess, evolution of him as a player in person, what, other than maybe, you know, what we see as his speed and his, you know, ability to change a game, how would you deal with someone like him?
If I were coaching against him, I'd give him a rough ride. He wouldn't have a lot of fun playing against my team. He'd get a steady. Now, I know they get the last change in the first 2 games, so that's going to help Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers try to keep him away from Barkov. But the problem is, if you keep him away from Barkov, then you go against Bennett. And if you try to keep him away against both those guys, then you get to go against Lundell, and you're not getting nearly the types of reps or the rhythm you need to have if you're going to be a star player. What I would try to do, and I don't know if Paul Coffey would do this or not, but this is Connor McDavid's Steve Yzerman moment. This is his Mario Lemieux moment. This is his Wayne Gretzky moment. This is his Mark Messier moment. I would show tape of all those great players. This is his Nathan McKinnon moment, his Sidney Crosby moment, if you want to get more recent. Show them tape in particular, of what all those great players did to help influence the outcome of their team's Stanley Cup run for the first time. And I'd play it to music, and I would show it. And I would find out what his favorite music is, and I would make a tape of that. And I'd say, here, Connor, this is what you're going to do. This is going to be you. You're going on that list with all those great players. So that's how I would do it.
I love what you said just there, because you reminded me of Dr. Joe Dispenza, who is it's sort of like an interesting like mental health doctor, psychologist. Like he talks about in one of his books called Supernatural, making like a mind movie and playing it to music. When you said pair it with music, you make something like showing basically what you want in life, or sort of like a vision board or visualizing something. When you put it with music, so and then you watch it like when you go to bed and whatnot, and then you keep doing that kind of like every night. And also whenever you hear that music, you think of yourself, or you think of that movie sort of playing. So then if you were doing that with Connor McDavid, and then he hears the music or any of that, it's just like locks him into those moments. I think that there's such an interesting way with using the mental aspect of the game, especially when it feels as though Connor McDavid is playing it feels otherworldly at points, because he is able to rise to the occasion in these moments where they need him. My question on that is that, like, if he's able to rise to the occasion in the most stressful, pressure intense moments, or when his team needs him most, how come he isn't always like that? How come it has to be sort of those moments?
Well, I think because other teams really pay attention to him, and he gets a rough ride for a star athlete, especially at this time where his speed is so omnipresent. You're so aware of his speed all the time. People are always trying to take away those first two steps. And for him, that gets him out of his rhythm. That gets him out of his comfort zone. And that's why I think it's really hard for him. But now this is a deeper Edmonton Oilers team. And so because of that depth, I think it helps him, especially playing Draisaitl in the 2-hole. I think that helps him too. It creates a matchup problem for the opposition. Not everybody has the same depth as the Florida Panthers do when it comes to marking up on people. So we'll see. But, I had a really long talk with Mario Lemieux, one of my old players, this winter. And we were talking about different players around the league. We were talking about Sidney Crosby. We were talking about Nathan MacKinnon. We were talking about Sasha Barkov. Talking about different players. And I got to MacKinnon. He said, Pierre, I've never seen a player in my time do what he does at the speed that he does it at. He says, I marvel at that every time I watch the guy. And I can tell you right now, Mario Lemieux knows more about players than probably any star player I know, because he watches a ton. He really evaluates it, and his mind can slow down and actually appreciate what the player does. And when he told me that, Julie, I was blown away, because Mario doesn't really hand out a lot of flowers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's a pretty hard marker, but he was overwhelmed by how good, Connor McDavid is.
Right. So when we talk about how deep Florida is, and it really just feels as though they could easily repeat again. One question before I get into the one I was just about thinking of asking you is the fact that they have gone to 3 consecutive Stanley Cup Finals, and that's the first time, other than sort of the COVID era with Tampa, but since Edmonton in 83 to 85, they've played in 11 playoff series. They won 10 of them, and this is since 2023. This is an extremely large amount of hockey. In what way has them having played so many extra games than other teams? And we know that, of course, Edmonton went to the final last year, but they didn't go the year before like Florida. How does that maybe affect or influence them as a team, even how they train, how they play? Because they've had to carry on so much more of a weight load than other teams, but it doesn't seem to have affected them.
Well, they subtle additions. Number one, Nico Mikkola is a good example of that. Seth Jones is a good example of that. Obviously, Brad Marchand's a good example of that on the Florida side. They had a lot of guys playing in the Four Nation event. So that took a lot of juice out of them too.
Right.
So if you notice where they finished, they didn't finish in the top 2 in the Atlantic Division. They finished 3rd. So they knew when to back off. Load management, I know people hate that term, but I got to believe load management was part of that for the Florida Panthers. And also, and this is a true story, they live in South Florida, and people heal up a lot better when they're in warm weather rather than cold weather. They just do. It's sunshine makes a big difference. And I know people don't want to hear that in Edmonton in particular. Yeah. You don't have sun there in the winter, and when you do, it's 50 below zero out. And trust me, I spent a lot of time there. I grew up in a place very similar to that in Mont-Tremblant, Quebec. But when you're in the sun, I think it helps them a little bit. But here's the biggest thing about Florida, the experience that you've already wisely talked about, Julie. there's experience that goes into this. You know, when we won in 91 and 92 in Pittsburgh, we were better prepared for the 92 run than we were in the 91 run. And we did something in 92 that had never been done before and has never been done since. Think about that. That's 33 years ago. We won 11 straight games to win the Stanley Cup. 3 in the second round against the Rangers in a row, 4 against Boston in a row, 4 against Chicago in a row. 11 straight games to win the Stanley Cup. Nobody did it before that, and nobody's done it since. And I think a big reason we were able to do it, we were better prepared as a coaching staff and as players to be ready for the trials and tribulations. And I think that's where Florida is right now.
Okay, I can see that, and that's an incredible stat that you guys will have probably for a very long time. It's an incredible accomplishment to be able to go on a winning streak like that in the Stanley Cup Final, and in Stanley Cup playoffs too. But then on the other side, in being better prepared, in what way is that true for Edmonton?
It's very true, and that's why I don't think they'll fall behind 3-0 in this series like they did last year. You know, they fell behind 3-0, and then they made this unbelievable push to force a Game 7. I don't think that will happen this year. But I will tell you this, and I'm very comfortable saying this. Most times in the Stanley Cup Final, Game 1 doesn't matter. It does not matter. I think Game 1 matters a lot in this one, in Edmonton. Because if Florida is able to impose their will early on and plant a mini seed of doubt early on in the series, I think that becomes a problem for Edmonton, especially without Zach Hyman. So Game 1, I think, matters more. And one other thing about that, Toronto has been the best and hardest test for the Florida Panthers. Force them to a 7-game series. But think about it. Toronto won their first 2 games on home ice. They were comfortable, and they had a lead in Game 3 and then eventually lose in overtime. Florida got a lot out of that. They learned about themselves. And one of the things they learned, we could lose 2 games on the road, but when we come home, we can buckle up and get back in the series. I don't know if Edmonton's got that in them right now. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch as we go along here.
Do you think, though, that maybe Edmonton, I felt as though Edmonton has shown that they can come back, especially, well, last year, as you mentioned, them being down 3 games, coming back, and then also against LA, right? So don't you think that maybe, just to counterpoint what you said, that they, even if they did lose Game 1, they have a belief? I think that the Leafs, as you just because you mentioned them, I think they have a belief in themselves that they could come back because they've shown that they have before.
Oh, no, I agree with that part. I think you're onto something there. This is a difference. The experience of Florida. That's why we're talking about the experience part. That LA team, they haven't won a Stanley Cup since 2014, and only Anze Kopitar and Drew Doughty are left from those teams. That's a big roster swing. So that's why I said that. The Florida Panthers aren't the LA Kings. And that's why I think this becomes a really hard equation for Edmonton to figure out if they can't get through Game 1 with a win. I would just say this. Critical that they establish the identity they want for their team early in the series, because if you look at the teams that played Florida that have lost, Tampa lost their identity in their series. Toronto clearly lost their identity in that series. And if you look at Carolina, they never had their identity at any time in the series. They never had their identity because Florida got them to play out of their identity. Edmonton cannot afford to have that happen to them.
So then what aspect of Edmonton's identity do you think will give Florida the biggest challenge?
The speed quotient. If they play up-tempo, transition the puck quickly from defense to offense, get out of their own zone, spend more time in the neutral zone with the puck, more time attacking off the rush, and more time off the cycle, they'll get Florida to take penalties. They'll get on the power play. That's when Evan Bouchard becomes a factor. That's when Corey Perry becomes a factor. That's when Leon Draisaitl becomes a factor. And that's when Connor McDavid really becomes a factor. So they need to spend more time with the puck. They need to spend more time attacking. They need to spend more time forcing Florida to be uncomfortable, taking penalties. They've shown they do that. And the other thing that's really important for Edmonton, they need to win faceoffs. McDavid's not great on faceoffs. Draisaitl hasn't been 100% great. Henrique's probably their best faceoff guy. They need to be better on faceoffs than Lundell, Nosek, Bennett, and Barkov. And if they're not, Edmonton will be uncomfortable in the series because they're not going to have the puck enough.
Right. Okay, so to wrap up this part of our conversation on the Stanley Cup, talking to you now, my takeaway is that the Florida Panthers are the clear favorite, and this is their Stanley Cup to probably lose. That would be my takeaway, but I'm not sure if that's how you feel.
Oh, I think this is going to be a tough series. If Edmonton wins game one, I think it's going to be a really tough series. But I think if they lose I've never seen a game one, from how I'm evaluating it, matter so much. I can tell you right now, in 91, when we won the Cup, we lost game one to Minnesota, and we got wiped out on faceoffs. They had Mark Bureau and Bobby Smith and Dave Gagne. They wiped us, Neil Broughton. They wiped us out on faceoffs. So I think there were 82 faceoffs in the game. And I'll never forget the late Badger Bob Johnson said, make a tape of every faceoff in the game and bring in Trottier, Lemieux, Francis, all our centermen, Randy Gillen, Kenny Priestley, bring Yuri Herdina, bring them all in. Let's have a meeting. So we did. And we never lost faceoffs again. And we ended up winning the series in 6. And we won game 6, 8-0. But I'm telling you, I'm worried for Edmonton that if they lose game one and they lose a faceoff battle in game one, especially because it's on home ice, that's going to be a tricky wicket for them to overcome. I'm telling you, it's going to be really difficult.
Can see that winning game one at home in a Stanley Cup final is so critical just for the obviously winning, just getting closer to winning the cup, but also the idea that like if you don't win at home, that is like you had the advantage to start this whole series and take advantage of it, and you didn't. And then that's, as you said, a little bit more doubt. Even though they can and come back, and they've shown that they can come back, it still does add something to them, to the fact that, maybe we're not necessarily in the position we want to be in. And when you look at moments in games, because it feels as though this Stanley Cup playoffs, in particular, moments are a big thing versus just like a game in general. We could hear from Craig Berube, just like certain moments where things don't go your way, or you aren't possessing the puck, or you aren't able to win faceoffs, and those then turn into a bigger aspect of the game. Puck possession, time in whatever zone you're in, anything like that, and being able to then just generate any kind of offense whatsoever. So we'll be looking for that in game one. And before we go, this is obviously Toronto Sports Rush, so I got to ask you some very obvious questions, but I'm here in Toronto right now, and I was reading the Toronto Star yesterday, and there was a column from Damian Cox that said that re-signing Mitch Marner is the Leafs really, they have to try to re-sign Mitch Marner because where he plays, how he plays, what kind of player he is, there is not anyone else out there that could possibly be a better addition for this team right now. Regardless of the fact that things didn't go well in the playoffs, this is still such a huge player that has been part of their organization. What do you think about the idea of the Leafs and people saying, actually, we should keep Mitch Marner?
Well, at what cost? Mitchell's a tremendous talent. We all know that. He's a 100-point player plus. Everybody knows that. I'm going to go back to, again, personal experience. And I think what Damian wrote is not far off. In fact, I commend him for doing that. It's opinion that's probably a little bit different than a lot of people in the area. Mm-hmm. So I really admire when people go against the grain a little bit. I remember when we traded Mark Recchi and Paul Coffey to Philadelphia from Pittsburgh, which is kind of like heresy. You don't make deals with Philly if you're Pittsburgh.
Right.
Back in the day. And we brought in Rick Tocchet, Kjell Samuelsson, and Kenny Reggett. And I remember people just crucified our management team for making that deal. And the reason why we did it is we knew what we had with a player like Sean McEachran, who was coming in from the U.S. Olympic team that most people didn't even know existed. We knew what we had in Kevin Stevens. We knew what we had in Joey Mullen. We knew what we had with some other players deeper in our lineup like Troy Loney and Phil Bourque and Jay Caulfield. So we were comfortable making that trade. But what we needed was somebody that could be a plow horse to open up room for Mario. That was Rick Tocchet. And we needed to stabilize our own zone, especially with Jimmy Pack playing on the left side and Kjell Samuelsson playing on the right side. And we were able to do that with the addition of Kjell. And we needed a backup goalie for Tommy. And that's why we brought in Kenny Reggett. And so everybody killed us on that deal. And it kind of reminds me, everybody, if Toronto doesn't sign Mitchell, they're going to crucify him. But what happens if they find a guy that fits the profile for what they need right now? And they might be able to do that. And one other thing, congratulations to the Hunter brothers and to the London Knights and all their fans. Easton Cowan's a pretty darn good offensive player. And the last guy that came from London that played for Toronto, his name's Mitchell Marner. And I'm not saying Easton Cowan's going to replace Mitchell Marner right away. But the Mitchell Marner you see now wasn't the Mitchell Marner you saw when Mike Babcock was a coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs. It changes over time. Guys get better. So I wouldn't be in a rush to do it if it wasn't at my price point, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Mitchell's going to have to give him a hometown discount because they got to be cap compliant and they got to be smart going forward because they do have some really good players coming along Toronto. They really do.
Right. That's a great point about Easton Cowan and to the London Knights. And I mean, what an incredible organization to be able to be so successful for so many years and produce so many incredible players. So I guess what would be one other question on the Leafs before we go? When you're sitting here, this is the tough time for teams that have been eliminated from the playoffs and the Stanley Cup is going on still. Where do you think the Leafs mindset and maybe from a management perspective, where is it now compared to a week or so ago when they were eliminated and tensions were high? And a week or so, so longer than that. Tensions have been high about the Leafs, but because time has passed, how have things changed, if at all, about the future of this team or where it is right now?
Brendan Shanahan's not part of the equation anymore. So I think that's taken away a layer of management that maybe some people in Toronto weren't happy with. I had no problem with it. I know Brendan. I watched them work. I think they did a lot of really good things over Brendan's tenure. They just couldn't find a way to get, traction in the playoffs. But I think that's kind of appealed to the fan base. And that's not to blame Brendan. Everybody wanted something out of this. And now, so they got that. The red meat was kind of thrown to the fans. I think Keith Pelley getting more involved in this is going to be positive, not negative, because he understands the market so well. And I think that's an important market to understand. And I think the third thing is they've had a chance to dissect what they liked about their American League team, what they didn't like about their American League team. They'll adjust that. And then they had a chance, I think, to digest what they liked about their NHL team and what they didn't like about their NHL team. And I think they've had a chance to address that, or will have a chance to address that. So I think it's been more positive than negative in Toronto. Brad had some really good, statements. And the one that stands out is we got to change the DNA. I don't think you have to throw everything out, but I do think they have to become a harder team still to play against. And they need some supplemental offense from the defense and need some supplemental offense from the depth players. Right.
It is a unique place to be when you are part of the Toronto Maple Leafs and you've had so much pressure on you. And also, he said that there's sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, but kind of like there's some scars when you go through these big losses in Game 7s. He said he'd been here for 2 of them now, one in the first round last year, this one in the second round this year, that kind of become part of your identity in a way. And I think I wouldn't know the answer to it, but I don't know how you would deal with making your team be able to sort of change their fate in those moments, because it is something that is not seen in any other marketplace. I mean, I would say it can't. I think that would be, the Leafs are, it's got to be the most interesting place to have to play because of the pressure and the fans and the history and everything like that. So I think there's an added layer that goes to being part of that DNA. So I don't know what he's going to do to try to rectify that, but that is certainly going to be part of, I'm sure, obviously, the future of this team going forward is figuring out how do we not crumble under the pressure, especially at home in these massive, massive moments. Pierre.
Part of dealing with that, though, Julie, just one more thing. If you don't bury your head in the sand, chances are you can fix it. For a long time, there was a lot of patting on the back saying, oh, yeah, we had a great regular season. We did this and we did that. And then they bury their head in the sand. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. And I think that's why I'm really encouraged having Keith Pelley involved in the process. I was signed by him. I worked for him. I've known him a long time. He doesn't tolerate this kind of stuff. And they'll find a solution to get it fixed. I'll tell you that right now.
Right. I think it gets to a certain point of, okay, we've got to do something to fix this right now, or else nothing will change, right? It's whatever, as everyone says, definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. And you get the same results as we've seen over and over again. So hopefully for Leafs Nation and for all the players on the team and the organization, whatever changes they make are for the better, for the team, for their families, for their livelihood, everything like that. Because as we know, this goes far beyond what happens on the ice. It's also so much more that happens off the ice. Okay, well, this will be, we'll end things here because there's so much more we could continue talking about, whether it's the Leafs forever or the Stanley Cup Final, which will begin on Wednesday. And Pierre, thanks so much for your insight and analysis as always. And guys, make sure you like and subscribe. We'll be here for the rest of the Stanley Cup Final and beyond.
Thanks for watching Toronto Sports Rush on the Bet Rivers Network.